Okay, I just want to mention that we're recording this event because several people asked if we could do so because of the time zone differences. They weren't able to attend. But I think we're going to start. It's the half hour on my clock, so I want to get going. Since we have a tight schedule, I have 3 presenters. Anyway, I welcome you to this event, this webinar on control of invasive plant species in national parks and protected areas. Appreciate you joining us. I had a lot of interest. Over 50 people signed on from 20 different countries, so that was quite good. Anyway, my name is David Cruson. I'm with the National Park Service Office of International Affairs. And today we have 3 presenters, one from Israel, one from the United States, and one from South Africa. Each of them will have 25 minutes to present after I introduce them. And then at the end, we will have about 30 minutes for questions and answers. If you have a question or comment, just raise your hand or put your comment into the chat box, and we'll go around the room and get your question. So one other point, I have 2 more upcoming webinars that I hope to do. One will be on control of invasive animal species in national parks and protected areas. And then I also hope to have one on management of fossil resources in national parks. So I hope you'll consider joining us for those. So I think that's it. Please keep yourself on mute so there's no background noise for our presenters. But up first is Jean-Marc from Israel. He's a consultant in applied ecology, a specialist of alien invasive plant AIP control management. He is currently working as a consultant for the Israel Ministry of the Environment, the Israel Nature Reserves and Parks Authority, and for other governmental offices. His recent works focus on the control of AIP in protected areas, and particularly the control of invasive tree species. He has been working on AIP control projects in Cyprus and in Israel, in the Mediterranean, and semi-arid and arid regions. So Jean-Marc, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Trying to share my. Okay.
We did practice this, but hopefully they'll be able to connect to my screen.
Let me know if you.
Oh, there you go. I see it.
Okay, you see it in the display mode?
I see an animal, yeah.
In the display mode, right? It's okay?
Yeah, we can see it's not, there's a small slide on the right and a big slide in the middle or the left.
What about now?
Okay, that's it.
That's okay. So I can start?
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, so good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. I will try to, during this talk, I try to share practical information we have acquired here in Israel regarding the control, the prevention, but also mainly the control of invasive species, with a special focus on invasive trees. I will say a few words at the beginning regarding the characteristics of protected areas in Israel and the consequences regarding the control of invasive taxa. Then I will address the issue of prevention in Israel. I will explain what is the main tool we are using here in Israel in order to try to prevent the introduction of new invasive plant taxa. Then I will explain what we are doing in terms of early detection and rapid response with an example related to the control of Ambrosia Confertiflora, the burr ragweed, which is a recent invasive in Israel, which is coming from southern Texas, northern Mexico, and has become a very concerning invasive plant in Israel for the past 20 years. Then, at last, I will give some examples of practical control of established populations of invasive trees with a special attention to Akatsiya Saligna. So when we consider protected areas in Israel, we have to keep in mind three main characteristics. The first one is that despite Israel is a very, very small country, we experience three types of climates. Roughly speaking, the northern half of the country is experiencing a Mediterranean type climate, which is what you can see on the map on the left, which is the CSA according to Köppen classification. And the southern part of the country, the Negev desert, is experiencing an arid climate. And we have a narrow strip between the two with a semi-arid climate. So it means that in terms of alien invasive plant control management, many aspects that are relevant in Israel may be also relevant for quite a lot of countries in the world where a Mediterranean climate prevails or arid or semi-arid climates. And when we put all together, it's quite a lot of countries. So of course, because of those type of climates in Israel, the invasive species that we find in Israel are coming from other arid regions and from other Mediterranean type regions. You can see here a few examples with the Prosopis joliflora, a very, very famous invasive tree that we unfortunately have also in the southern part of the country. Akatsiya Saligna, which is an Australian wattle from the southwest part of Australia, which is today the most widespread invasive tree in Israel. I guess most of you know also Carpobrotus edulis, which is a plant from South Africa, from the Mediterranean region of South Africa. And as I said at the beginning, Ambrosia Confertiflora, which is coming from the southern US, and which is also invading both in the Mediterranean part of the country, but also in the arid part of the country. The second characteristic of protected areas in Israel is that Israel is unfortunately a very, very densely populated country. And over the past 20-25 years, we have a lot of land development. So we have more and more transportation networks, built up areas, cultivated areas. So all these are putting very high pressure. They represent very high propagule pressure onto protected areas that are generally quite small. And so it means that we are always facing new invasive plant taxa in our protected areas. And the third characteristic, the last one I want to specify here, is that Israel is a very, very small, a very tiny country. You can see on the left the map of Israel on the background of other countries such as the US, India, Australia. Israel is a very, very small country. Actually, it's more or less the size of New Jersey. And when you combine this with the precedent characteristic I have mentioned, it means that when an alien plant establishes within a protected area, because this area is quite small and there is a lot of pressure, then the the protected area is very rapidly affected by the plant and sometimes covered completely by the plant. You have here an example, which is quite extreme example. In the middle, you see an aerial picture of a pond, which is stuck between a highway on the east and the cultivated fields on the west. And recently, someone dropped a water lettuce within this pond. And within few weeks, the whole size of the pond was covered with and is covered to this day by the water lettuce. And this happens because protected areas, natural areas, are very small in Israel. Now, regarding the prevention, about 10 years ago, we have compiled a list of ornamental alien species that we do not want to use in Israel and to be used in landscaping programs. This list was, of course, initially published in Hebrew, but we had also an English translation, and it was published also in Arabic. And this list comprises about 150 taxa. Some of them are already introduced in Israel, some are not. And we have considered each of these taxa, and we know that in other regions that experience Mediterranean type climates, arid or semi-arid climates, those taxa are invasive. So the probability that they will also behave like invaders in Israel is very high, and we don't want them to be introduced in a gardening and landscaping program. So we have compiled this list, which is today used in most institutions and governmental offices and private offices of landscape architects. And each time there is a new landscaping program, we ask the team to check that the plants the species they want to plant in the program are not listed in this list, and if they are so, we ask them to use other species, even if those are alien species but non-invasive species. So this is the main tool, and to tell you the truth, we have to update it because it's already 10 years old, and the dynamic of invasive plants is very quick. So we must update this list, and I believe this list can be of some help for many other countries with Mediterranean or arid climates. A more recent tool we have been developed is the edition of fact sheets for inspectors that are working for the Ministry of Agriculture and are located in harbors or in airports. And the goal is to enable them to identify some of the plant taxa that are banned for import, in Israel. So we have developed, we have edited few fact sheets, of course, also in Hebrew. This one was translated into English for this webinar. And this is a secondary tool, more recent tool that we are using now for prevention. With an example here with the Monocoria astata, which is like most of invasive aquatic species, a very nice plant. Regarding what we used to call early detection and rapid response, in the mid 1990s, it turned out that a plant named Ambrosia Confertiflora managed to get into Israel, probably from the southern United States. We don't know exactly how, but since then, this plant, which is a perennial herbaceous, is probably the worst invasive herbaceous plant species today in Israel. It invades in all the country, also in the Mediterranean part of the country, but also in the arid region. It displaces all native species. It proliferates within cultivated lands into protected areas, especially along riverbanks and in wetlands and in riparian habitats. So we have edited a small information booklet in Hebrew, in English, also in Arabic. And we are since then mapping quite accurately the FOTSI of this plant. And today we have a team which is which activity is designed to control all the new FOTSI that we get that are reported to the National Park Authority. And the main goal in this early detection and rapid response strategy here is to try to prevent the proliferation of Ambrosia Confertiflora in the Galilee, which is the northern part of the country, that you can see on the middle map here, but also on the Golan Heights, because in these two regions, there are quite a few FOTSI of these plants so far. So it is still possible to stop the proliferation. And accordingly, also we try to prevent the proliferation of this plant in the Negev desert. So the main objective is to try to contain the proliferation of this plant, preventing it to proliferate in the north and in the south. While in the central region, where this plant is thriving, unfortunately, we are beginning to try to eradicate the smallest FOTSI. So we are left with only the main FOTSI in this region. There is a team that you can see on the right here with the cars and the tools, and several people are working only on that on this plant for the rapid response. The control so far is done with a foliar spray of imazapyr with a quite high concentration, 5%. We are now trying to develop another type of control, but this is not official yet. The first results that we get from this EDRR activity are very positive, because we managed to keep the proliferation in check, especially in the north and in the south. And we think that in the coming month, we will give a new task to this team that will be to control also the very few so far, but new FOTSI of Parthenium, the Parthenium weed, also one of the most famous invasive plants in the world, that unfortunately has begun to proliferate in Israel, but also Leucaena leucocephala, which also is beginning to develop and invade in Israel. Now, and this is the main part, regarding the control of already established species, invasive species that have already established in most part of the country and creating large FOTSI. One of them, which is probably the most widespread invasive taxa in Israel, is Akatsiya Saligna, which is a native to southwest Australia, a Mediterranean region, Mediterranean climate type region of Australia. It was introduced to Israel by the British during the 20s, means 100 years ago. We find it also in Malta, in Cyprus, and all the areas where the British were ruling. And unfortunately, this plant has become in Israel what we call an invasive transformer. It proliferates everywhere, especially in sandy habitats, but also in riparian habitats. As you can see on the right, it creates very dense stands of trees that outcompete all native species. We even don't find many animal species, native animal species in those stands. So this is a real problem. So in the past 2 years during the pandemic era, because we had a lot of unemployed people in Israel, the government decided to launch a campaign for the control of Akatsiya Saligna in protected areas and national parks. So we considered our options regarding the control. We know that mechanical control of Akatsiya Saligna, like most of wattles, is ineffective and counterproductive, because the more you cut it, the more it sprouts and produces root suckers. And this is a problem that we have also with other species. You can see here pictures from Botswana where they're cutting and cutting again Prosopis, but the more you cut it, the more you get root suckers and new stems. Biocontrol for Akatsiya Saligna is not available in Israel, and it was developed very much in South Africa since the mid-80s, with at the beginning some success, but more recently researchers have published papers indicating that the biocontrol of Akatsiya Saligna was probably less efficient than initially anticipated. So what we had left was only the chemical control. But the chemical control of Akatsiya Saligna must, in order to be successful, it must fulfill several conditions. First, we must be able to control the major trees, which are quite tall. Some of them are even more than 7 or 8 meters. Foliar spray, of course, is not possible when we are dealing with tall trees. The control technique must be implementable in all types of terrains. It must be very easy to apply. If we use too sophisticated control method, then it cannot be successfully applied. So we need something simple and easy. Of course, it must be cheap. That means that we had to find a control technique that enables us to control maximum of trees per time period. It was important that this technique relies on simple tools and light tools, low tech, without electric batteries or gasoline gear and tools. Of course, since we are working in protected areas, it had to be very effective with small volumes of herbicide. We couldn't pour too large volumes of herbicides in protected areas. It had to be based on a herbicide with an excellent ecotoxicological profile. And of course, it must be safe for other species around. So all these together are quite a lot of constraints, but we managed to meet those conditions by choosing to control Akatsiya Saligna with a direct application of very small quantities of herbicides right into the cambium of the trees. So we used what we call the hack and squirt technique, with an herbicide which is called aminopyralide. It's quite a new one in use in the US, and then now it's registered also in the EU very recently. You have here some details about the type of aminopyralide. And so when we use aminopyralide with direct application with the hack and squirt technique, so we have no foliar spray, which is very important in order not to harm other species that we want to keep in the protected areas. We didn't have to cut down the trees. This point is very important. Since we do not cut down the trees, but only harm them in order to inject the herbicide, this does not induce the sprouting of root suckers. And while you inject this product in the tree, because you do not cut down the tree continues to suck up waters from down up to the leaves and sugars from the leaf down, And this helps very much to translocate the herbicide within the tree, and eventually it kills it. So the control steps, practical steps for the applications are quite simple. You make some cuts with an axe or a knife if you're working on small trunks on the tree. Then immediately you apply some very small quantities of aminopyralid. The ratio here was 1 milli for about 2 inches, which is about 5 centimeters of trunk diameter. That means that a diameter of 15 centimeters can be controlled with only 3 milliliters of herbicide. It is very important to apply the herbicide immediately right after the cut. And of course, if you work in pairs, it goes very quickly. So when applying this technique, you can control a tree each 30 seconds, which is a very short time, of course. And the results were fantastic. We got other 94% of dead trees after the first control, which is an unprecedented rate of success for the control of this tree with this technique. So we apply this technique in many protected areas in the country. You can see here some examples in the central region of Israel. You see on the right that the trees are dying within a very short time period if you apply the control during the hot season. Also here all the pictures from the control within the coastal sand dunes in the country. See, because we are not using foliar spray, native species can re-emerge. This was applied, you can see here pictures from the Galilee region next to the Tiberias Lake. On the right, you can see the trees that have been controlled are now brown and one was missed. And on the picture, you can see it's blooming. And what is important is that we have also applied this technique onto other invasive trees, such as Prosopis joliflora. We made some control in the Negev desert, also on multi-stem individuals. And we got also with this species very encouraging results. Although we had to use a small, slightly bigger volume of herbicides, but it was very effective. So we have done many training of rangers for the control of other invasive trees. Here with on the left, they're controlling a wattle which is named Akatsiya Saligna, also an Australian wattle, but invading in the arid part of the country. It works also on Akatsiya victoria, as you can see on the right. So the conclusion of this is that over the past 15 years, 17 years, we have made very, very significant progress in Israel in the control of invasive trees. This was possible because of the technique that we have developed and used now with the aminopyralid, and sometimes also with other herbicides, for example, with the Nicotiana glauca, we are using imazapyr. And this was really a game changer. This was the first time that we were able to get control over the large 40 that we thought we could never manage to remove, and now it's possible, and we can apply this also to other species. And we think that it can be applied also to other tree species in other countries. And the next challenge, of course, will be to eradicate Ambrosia Confertiflora. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very interesting, and congratulations on your success with the hack and squirt. I love that title. Okay, up next is Terry Hogan with the National Park Service. Terry has been a plant ecologist for nearly 30 years and is the national lead for the National Park Service Invasive Plant Program. And she addresses threats posed by invasive plant species and NPS resources. She also oversees the NPS Invasive Plant Management Team program that provides invasive plant management support and expertise to units of the National Park System. She has natural and cultural resource management experience in national parks, has worked on landscape scale collaborative efforts, and is active in a range of interagency and non-governmental organizations and committees and work groups that work on invasive species issues within the United States and North America. So Terry, take it away. Thanks.
All right, thank you. I am going to share my screen, hopefully. Can you see it?
Yes, we can. Thanks. That's great.
All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome, and thank you for joining. I am going to, as Jean-Marc did, I'm going to start with kind of an overview, really, of the units of the National Park System, and then some of the challenges that we all face. And then I'll dive into the management of invasive plants with a focus on the resources that we provide within the National Park Service. So there are 423 park units within the National Park System that cover more than 85 million acres. They're found in all 50 states, the District of Columbia, and U.S. territories, and most of the management decisions are made at the park level. In the regional and the national office, we provide guidance, support, policy development, and policy interpretation. So there are 20 naming designations within the National Park Service system, and they cover resources that are protected within national parks that are natural and cultural and historic. And we also include some recreational sites. All of these designations have management implications associated with them, and they range from national parks to national battlefields to national recreation areas. So we know the problem, it's a big problem. In 2021, there was an estimate within the National Park Service of 1.7 million acres infested by invasive plants. 3.3% of those were considered to be under control. And we know new species come in all the time, so we're addressing new invasions along with established invasions. A study conducted in 2020 using 1,400 permanent forest plots spanning 12 years and covering 39 eastern parks found that invasive plant trends within national parks were increasing. So plant abundance was increasing. In fact, 80% of the parks in the study had at least one significant increase in a target invasive species. We also know that invasive plant species don't recognize our boundaries. So the work that we do within the national parks, we also need to collaborate outside. And we have, the problem is large. I'll go back to that. It's a big problem. And how many people and how much money would it really take to fully address it? So we have capacity issues also. And then there's climate change. The impacts of climate change, which include catastrophic fire, extreme storm events, long-term drought, invasive species are shifting their ranges, and native plant communities are becoming unstable. So we use a range of management techniques, including strategic planning, which I've added here. I want to talk just briefly about that. And again, some of the resources available. And I'm going to try to put links to the resources in the chat, but if you're interested in any of these, you can always email me and I can send you a document with links. Then I want to talk a little bit about prevention and early detection and rapid response, how we manage established populations and collaboration to leverage our efforts. And again, I'm really going to focus on the resources that we provide to help parks do the work that they need to do. So strategic planning is very important, and at the park level, it's their responsibility to identify the desired conditions, and they do that through a range of planning documents, lots of planning documents, including resource stewardship strategies, which many of the parks are developing right now. And they're also responsible for compliance with environmental and historic resource protection laws. While at the national level, we provide a range of resources to help them with the planning process. And I'm going to put my first one in the chat, which is Invasive Plant Management Planning Guidance, Technical Considerations, which is a wonderful document created primarily by Scott Abella and Sandy Dingman that helps parks think through the process of developing an invasive plant management plan. And then also the Climate Change Response Program, which is also a National Park Service program, provides so much support to parks, including the Resist, Adapt, Direct, or RAD framework to help with planning. So I am going to put a link to that in here as well. They also conduct workshops directly with parks for scenario planning to help parks think through the future various scenarios that they may face with climate change. And then in the national program, the Pest and Invasive Species Management Work Group has put together a website, and we're really working hard to beef this website up to provide lots of resources for parks in their planning efforts. And so I want to point out the project kit and just show you a quick example of how it's set up. So parks can identify what they want to do, whether they want to, work on prevention, early detection and rapid response, control and eradication or restoration. They can click on any of these. It'll take them to a checklist that's based upon integrated pest management and IPM process, which guides land managers to select the most effective and economic techniques that pose the least risk to the environment and to human health and safety. And so you can click on any of these to get more information. So if you were to review available tools and best management practices, it would take you to another checklist and you can dive into more information there. So of course, prevention and early detection, rapid response, that's the biggest bang for our buck. Preventing species from moving or from being introduced really is the best way to manage the species. And we collaborate with a lot of organizations, including the North American Invasive Species Management Association, the Wildlife Federation, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, or Wildlife Forever, I'm sorry, to adopt campaigns that exist and have consistent messaging related to prevention. We also promote the North American Invasive Species Management Association weed-free materials. They provide certification and training and certified products. They certify products through their program. And then again, on our website, we provide contract language, for example, best management practices for cleaning construction equipment before they enter parks so that propagules aren't moved into parks. Early detection, rapid response is also very important. We develop a range of lists, and Dave mentioned the Invasive Plant Management Team program, which I'll talk more about later. But they develop EDRR lists, and they're on the lookout, and parks, they share those with parks to be on the lookout for early detection species so that they can be addressed quickly. Parks use citizen science because parks are educational in nature with interpreters who talk to the public regularly, and citizen science is a really good way to engage the public in invasive plant management by identifying early detection species, mapping them, and reporting them. And then we spend a fair amount of time prioritizing our efforts. So we in the Park Service sites are important. We have some very unique cultural resources and natural resources, so we might want to prioritize by sites, by pathways, of course, which Jean-Marc mentioned earlier, and then by species. And again, hearkening back to the early detection species and species you want to prevent. But populations do become established, and we do have some good news. Abella in 2014 synthesized the results of 56 studies reported in 60 publications that covered 35 parks in 20 states and 1 US territory, and included 157 invasive species. And he found in 87% of the studies that at least one focal invasive species was reduced in those parks. So we do see that invasive species in the Miller et al. Increase, but he did find that we have been successful. And in 30 of those studies evaluated the impact of on native species. And in 30 of those studies found that native species increased. Let's see. We biocontrol, the IPM program lead is really trying to encourage parks to use more biocontrol to contain widespread species and large populations where we really can't treat them successfully. We're including a lot of restoration efforts as well as part of invasive plant management. And then I'm going to talk a little more about some of the resources that are available for effective invasive treatment. So the invasive plant management team, I'll give you a little more information about that. That program was started in 2000, and there are 17 teams across the country. They serve 290 of the 423 National Park Service units, but they provide boots on the ground support for parks. They provide funding for projects, and oversight for those projects. They serve as a network of experts across the country, and they provide training to park staff. And they operate using a range of strategies based on the resources available to them and the limitations depending on where they are in the country. So I'm going to put a link to the 2021 Invasive Plant Management Team report, in case you're interested. And also as a consequence of the existence of these teams, we have standardized data report gatherings, management in general, with a system called the National Invasive Species Information Management System that was adapted from a sister agency, the Bureau of Land Management. And we're working to figure out how to incorporate park data into this. So right now it only contains data collected and managed by the invasive plant management teams. And so there have been a lot of successes within the IPMT program, and I just want to highlight a couple of them. So one is a joint effort between the Northern Rocky Mountain IPMT and the Upper Columbia Basin Inventory and Monitoring Network, both within the National Park Service. It's been conducted at Big Hole National Battlefield and Nez Perce National Historical Park, where an effort was made to control spotted knapweed population, Centaurea maculosa. And they were between 2013 and 2018, the population was reduced to 8% of its peak in 2012, using spot treatment of clopyralid and aminopyralid. And the effort actually was conducted in a place with a rare endemic species. And they tested prescribed fire as well and found that between treatment and prescribed fire, they were able, that the spotted knapweed is in control. And the rare plant, which is a penstemon, lemipenstemon or penstemon lemiensis, is stable with 3,000 plants. And the hillside is open as it would have been during the period of significance for these parks. And then Young et al. Conducted a study that was published in 2020 on Ailanthus altissima, or tree of heaven. The work was done at Buffalo National River over a 5 to 8 year period, and the control techniques varied over that period, from felling large diameter trees and stump treating to hand tools and stump treating, with triclopyr and imazapyr and triclopyr fluroxapyr combination, and some foliar treatment as well. And treatments during the first year reduced the population by an average of 66%. But after long-term repeated treatments, it led to decreases of 90% to 70%. That's within some of the plots. And in one of them, no Ailanthus was detected at the end of the study. So it was very successful. And the Park Service also uses a range of innovation and technology to conduct their work, which includes eDNA. It's used for aquatic species like Helodia in Alaska. It's relatively newly introduced, and they sample fairly regularly in Alaska to assure that to try to identify Helodia infestations or introductions. Drones have been used also for both invasive plant treatment and for mapping. Some parks have used detection dogs when invasive species are at low numbers. And then there's a really interesting project that's being conducted in Hawaii. It's a collaboration between the Pacific Islands, Ipmt, and the University of Hawaii's Hilo Spatial Data and Analysis Lab. And they've collaborated together to develop and continue to refine a helicopter-mounted detection system for a suite of invasive species. And to date, they've been able to pretty successfully identify 4 invasive species, as well as trees that have been infected by the fungal pathogen that leads to rapid ohia death. And then we do a lot of collaborative tool development, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as well. Our ability with the invasive to serve parks through the invasive plant management team program is somewhat limited, only 17 teams, 423 parks, and the teams only are able to serve 290 of those. So again, we're putting a lot of energy into this website development and serving of tools online. And one of those tools is a library of invasive species strategies that we are building upon. They were developed by parks, IPMTs, and regional offices, and we're serving them up and building upon those. There are more than 100 species strategies at this point. So you can select species strategies for invasive animals, pests, or invasive plants. And you get this is your result. For example, I chose golden bamboo. It gives identification tips, as well as information on identification of lookalike species, some understanding of the phenology, and then it covers a range of chemical and non-chemical control methods that have been used to control that species. And we can collaborate extensively with others, including the U.S. Geological Survey. So one example is the Invasive Species Habitat Tool, or INHABIT, which we have been working with them for some time on the development of it. We provide them the land manager's perspective. And it is an incredible collaboration between research scientists and on-the-ground land managers. So it's a habitat suitability modeling tool for over 100 invasive species, more being introduced, primarily plants, but some insects will be added to the system. It uses existing location information for target species that have been identified by land managers as being important, and a suite of national predictors that may be important in controlling the species distribution. And that information has been gathered from the literature. And this information is fed into different algorithms to develop mathematical relationships between where the species is and the environment, and to predict the suitability of habitat across the landscape. And USGS is building on this tool to develop a management prioritization tool. And there's a potential effort to track the success of biocontrol agents through this. And then another tool that's been developed by the USGS is the annual Brome Adaptive Management Tool. It includes 7 national parks, 2 inventory and monitoring programs, and 2 IPMTs. And it's a state and transition model. Using it, you feed information from plots on management techniques, which focus on prescribed fire and herbicide. So you extract the vegetation, they extract the vegetation monitoring data and information, collate the vegetation metrics for each of the monitoring plots. They update the parameters of the model every year. They feed the information to the tool learns. They also monitor the effectiveness within the plots of the various management strategies, and the tool learns and recommends management for coming years. And they update the model in the winter through meetings with land managers and the researchers. And parks and IPMTs also have been working very closely with the Southwest Biological Center, particularly Dr. Pamela Nagler, who is working with remote sensing-based research on riparian ecosystems to gain greater understanding. And part of this informs management and restoration efforts related to tamarisk removal and the tamarisk beetle, which is very successfully controlling tamarisk. But what comes next? In many cases, they're finding other invasive species popping up where the tamarisk was removed or killed. So other collaborative efforts include data sharing. There's a lot of data sharing going on in the United States that was really encouraged by the Western Governors Association. So data sharing with 4 of the major data aggregators in the US. We continue to collaborate with universities and other research agencies. And there are many work groups, as Dave mentioned in the introduction, that include agencies and states, tribes, and non-government entities. And one of those work groups actually developed an early detection rapid response framework for the US that's hopefully going to be implemented in the near future. So, and this is just to show you a few of the types of collaborative and learning networks, and there's a lot of power, of course, in collective learning and sharing. And then I'm really done, but I wanted to show you a couple pretty pictures because the national parks span such a wide range. This is from Haliaka Crater, and this is the endangered silver sword plant. So many species are endemic and very endangered in the Hawaiian Islands, Pacific Islands, and the invasive plant management teams do a lot of work to help protect those. And then the park road leading to Denali. So this is Denali in Alaska. And my contact information. So I do actually, I knew this would happen. I forgot to add a couple of the links, but I'll do that now. And that is it. I will give you back the screen, Dave.
Thank you very much, Terry.
Welcome.
That was very interesting. And I also wanted to ask if John Mark and Llewellyn could put their contact information in the chat box too, if that's okay. So our next speaker and final speaker is Lynn Foxcroft from the South African National Parks. He's been based in Kruger for 25 years, and he's responsible for coordinating the invasive alien species research program. His work focuses on conducting and collaborating on research that informs and supports monitoring, management programs, and policy development. He is the lead author in the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, thematic assessment on invasive alien species and their control. So, Llewellyn, take it away.
Hi, thanks, David. Let me share my.
If this works.
Let me share my screen. And
okay, it's in the. If you can show it as the slideshow. Right now, it's. Oh, there you go. Perfect. Great.
Okay, so it's gone through. Great. So thanks for the opportunity to share some of our experiences from South African National Parks and Kruger National Park. I'm first going to give some insights into the challenges that we face as an organization, and then I'll use Kruger National Park as one example of a large national park and how we're trying to deal with the threats that we're being challenged with from outside the park, and how we've evolved management plans over time and the current scenario. So I'll touch on a bit of our planning, just briefly give some idea of some of the approaches that we're taking, and then I'll just wrap up with some of the basic species-specific challenges that we have in Kruger to illustrate specific methods that we've been working with. So South African National Parks includes 19 national parks. It covers about 39,000 square kilometers, and it goes from very small size, 57 square kilometers, up to 20,000 square kilometers, which is Kruger. And it covers the country basically from one side to the other, occurring in almost all of our biomes, from the fynbos, the arid areas, and the semi-arid and arid areas. Now, of course, you could expect that there would be a wide range of alien species introduced because of this wide range of habitat, and obviously the high number of alien species in South Africa. I've just extracted a few of the parks and numbers of species to illustrate that. Kruger's sitting with around 400 alien species, and Table Mountain Garden Route just under 300. The species list is always being revised, and some of the, as we get new information, some are added or changed, but more or less this is what we're trying to deal with at the moment. I think it's important to note, though, not all of these are invasive. Many of the species, especially in Kruger, are ornamental alien species. Some of them we know will not become invasive, or extremely unlikely to. Although I'll touch on those a bit later on. Most of our challenges are plants, and all parks, all of our national parks have been invaded by alien plants, and most of the parks also by animals. And you can see a large number of animals, from fish to and birds and other mammals. So over time, the concern around alien species has grown quite substantially in national parks. In some of the parks, there's been an ongoing program for quite some time, certainly before 2001. But just using the data from the Working for Water program, the cost of control per year, you can see how it rapidly increased to the point where from 2013 to 2015, more than 100 million rand was being spent in national parks per year. And so this is quite a substantial amount of money if you think about the size of the organization. I've pulled out also just to illustrate the point, some of the parks with the highest control expenses. Garden Route National Park, Table Mountain and Agulhas have had a large portion of the funding allocated to them. That's partly because of the large number of alien species, the high invasibility of those species. You've got pines and Australian acacias, and also some of those areas of fynbos and with very high levels of endemicity and other species of concern. So a large amount of effort going in there. Also, a large amount of work going into Kruger and Elephant National Park. But another study showed that over a longer time period, over a 20-year time period, if we included the costs from Kruger National Park itself and other funding or donor funding agencies, the cost of control went up to over 350 million rand over, as I said, about a 20-year period. So this is an enormous amount of money that has been allocated to alien plant control. And this is almost all focused on plants. It's only in the last few years where we've been focusing or trying to deal with some animal invasions. Obviously, the national parks, as elsewhere, are regulated by or governed by various legislation. Obviously, the National Parks Act, but for invasive species specifically, the National Environmental Biodiversity Act, the Alien Invasive Species Regulations, and species lists that require control. We compared the national park list to these species lists in the NEMBA regulations. And I can just mention the three categories largely of alien species. 1A being those that must be eradicated largely. 1B, species that must be controlled. And then category 2 and 3 may be used under various permit or specific conditions. But what's important is in the national park context, these conditions largely fall away. So in essence, we're dealing with having to manage around 120 species. And this is just in the three most invaded parks. Obviously, there's a larger number of species in the rest of the parks. So this is a huge challenge, and we haven't been able to get on top of how to deal with all of these species at this point yet. So knowing all of this, and we have an idea of what species we're dealing with, we have quite good details on what occurs where and how much we've spent on clearing. But the challenge for us now is to work out how do we take the species that we require to clear by legislation, and then work out which ones we can manage, how we can manage it, which of those species that are likely to cause the biggest impact, both socially and in the biodiversity, so the ecosystem, and focus our attention on those using the resources that we have available. So to focus a bit in more detail on that, I'm going to use Kruger National Park, as I mentioned, and I'll start off with some of the external influences and challenges. And it's just by chance, I selected a country to Israel to show the context of Kruger. And I think it's really important to think of Kruger not just as a national park, but as a large national park that we have to manage. It's about 20,000 square kilometers, about 400 or just under 400 kilometers from north to south. So it's an enormous area that we have to try and manage with a large number of alien species, and obviously not having an unlimited amount of resources available to work with. But what's evident is even though Kruger is a very large area, it's still essentially an island in a bigger landscape with many different land uses around it. And Kruger's in the northeast of the country, bordered by Mozambique, and on the left, on the western side of the park, we have the higher lying areas and escarpment areas that are high rainfall areas. But what we also have is a range of land use types. And if we just look at the different colors there, the different colors of green adjacent to the park might be natural or semi-natural vegetation. The brown might be, or in some cases is mixed land use or grazing. Then we have commercial plantation forestry and urban areas all around the park. And if I zoom in right onto the park boundary, you can see that within 500 meters of the park boundary, which you can see from the river that adjacent to the train line that goes past, it's a high intensity urban area. So essentially in that case, it becomes like an urban park. Even though there's a hard boundary, obviously this doesn't stop invasive species moving across into the park. In another corner of the park, up to the park boundary along the southern boundary, the Crocodile River, there's high intensity agriculture, which includes sugarcane and various other fruit crops. In the northwest of the park, there's rural landscape, there's some agriculture, and then in the upper catchment, there's commercial plantation, commercial forestries. So all of these areas that have different alien species associated with them, obviously different proximity to Kruger, but also different abundances of those plants. So there's a continuous pressure of those on Kruger. And if we just use this figure again, all the major river networks drain from the higher lying areas to our west through Kruger and into Mozambique. And that's just illustrating the 5 major river systems. And you can see they come from quite far to the west of Kruger. And then on top of that, there's obviously the road network. And that just illustrates some of the larger road networks. And we know that in Kruger with work has shown that the rivers are a major source of invasion into the park. In some work we did a few years ago, we tested this looking at quaternary watersheds, and we looked at species that we considered high concern or major invaders, and we clearly found patterns of high alien species richness in the catchment of some of our big rivers. But overall, we found nearly twice as many alien species in the upper catchment than what we have in the park, except for some examples. But so this means there's a high propagal pressure that's going to keep coming down the park, into the park from outside. So not only having to manage the large area with inside, but also these challenges from the west. And as we saw in Terry's talk, obviously invasive species don't have any boundaries that can spread as they wish. We also have to look for various mechanisms that to facilitate cross-boundary and integrated management. So this is one example from the Kruger to Canyons Biosphere Reserve. It spans a number of land use types. So the core areas include protected areas like Kruger and the neighboring nature reserves and private reserves, and then different kinds of land use. And one of the programs in the Kruger to Canyon Biosphere is to get all the stakeholders together to manage invasive species collectively where possible. So the program shares information on what species, where they occur, what their priorities are, what they can focus on, to try and get a coordinated approach across the entire region. So it's not only each landowner trying to control something, or in many cases not do any control, but contribute to a broader effort. So I'll just go into some of the planning tools that we use, or not really tools, but documents that provide guidance for us. A lot of our clearing is through the Working for Water program. Some of you may know the Working for Water program, but it's a large national program that's been running since about 1996. And the program has a number of aims. One of them is to provide employment to poor communities, provide training, develop contractor skills, and the contractors often move into other areas outside of alien clearing and develop because they have the basic business skills developed from it. But so there's a social imperative linked to it, but also through the program, the aim was to clear watersheds in the upper catchments of trees, alien trees, so to restore natural water systems further downstream, and then also biodiversity. So it's got a focus on trying to protect biodiversity in various areas. So to support our clearing programs, we have developed a number of internal documents, for example, policy that directs invasive species management at our corporate level. And then this then cascades into various other procedures, for example, implementing procedure for alien clearing projects specifically, and how these are to be tackled. And then based on work that we did on ornamental species and then also pathways of invasion. So for example, here we looked at 8 of the most important pathways into national parks. And we found about 80% of the species that have or can invade national parks, our national parks, were ornamental species, and 60% through rivers, and then also about half of them could be animal dispersed. Now, what's important is for ornamental species, if we can effectively close that pathway as far as possible by managing it and putting plans in place to prevent introduction of ornamental species, we can then focus our work onto less easy to manage pathways such as rivers and some of the others such as animal and then also roads and tracks. So for Kruger, we introduced an ornamental alien plant and landscaping policy or protocol. So this is for all tourist camps or infrastructure in Kruger, and also for all the staff villages across the parks. So the idea is to remove all alien species, which we have been doing for a number of years, and replace them with local species. And we also bring in the national legislation, so removing the species that are not on the national regulations, and then species that we've designated as locally of concern, so removing those as well. And we've had quite good success with the program. Some of the camps now, there are very few alien species left, and those that are there are not known to be invasive anywhere and are in a process of being phased out over time. And then for all of our parks, we have management plans in place for different time periods or longer term plans, and then also shorter term plans that are specific to areas that designate different units that need to be controlled, and the species associated with them and the costs associated with those. And the framework that we're about to release has the aim of trying to identify which species we should be concerned about. As I showed, we have a large number of species inside parks. We know there are many species around the parks that are potentially invasive. So we need to try and work out which of those should get priority attention. So based on a framework that's used for determining species under the national regulations, we've now tailored this to help us identify species for management in national parks. We also have some monitoring programs in progress. This just illustrates one of them from Bontebok National Park, where the entire park was cut up into a grid, and every single one of those grid cells was searched. So you have a true absence reference. And then wherever the plants that you're identifying were found, they recorded the number of individuals per plot within those cells, and also the age of those plants. So over time, you can revisit those cells and see whether it's changed. This is a Akatsiya Saligna, different species. So you can find out what species you have in the different areas, and over time, with your control, see if you're having an effect on them. So some of the management approaches, we can have the best science done, but we're still relatively stuck with the tools that we're able to apply in many areas. And this has gone from, in the 1980s, physically digging out plants to treating them plants with herbicides, aerial application, and then biological control. And this is just one scene, a number of slides that I'll show you of Lantana camara control. In the 1980s, some impenetrable thickets, the teams working through them, slowly clearing them. This was along the Sabia River, and eventually they were quite successful in clearing it out, and it's been maintained. But other species that have emerged over the last few years include Parthenium, and it's extremely concerning at the moment. It's widespread in the southeast, and we've been applying a chemical control program, but also recently have introduced the biocontrol to support that. We're still struggling with the hyacinth. It has occurred for a number of decades on two of our rivers, but the challenge is that we have seasonal flooding in these rivers, and this is in 2013, for example, enormous floods that washed the system completely clear, but the plants come back fairly quickly. There's obviously a large amount of seed in the soil, in the sediment, so it germinates fairly quickly. So on this example on Engelhard Dam, one of our main areas, we did have spray programs in the past. We released biocontrol, and we might have to reintroduce some of the spray programs again to try and implement an integrated control program to open up these water bodies. But just as we've been struggling with those infestations in 2020, we found a new infestation of hyacinth. the first time in this entire river catchment it's been recorded. And so now we're trying to deal with how do we manage that particular invasion. Another aquatic weed that we've been working with is water lettuce or pistia. So this is one of the dams in the south of the park. And we used a chemical control program working from boats. But there's also additional challenges, of course, the dangerous animals that occur in all of our rivers or water bodies, but also the fact that we had to repeat the control application so quickly every season. So we introduced the snout weevil, and after a number of years, we went through cycles of clear and covered, and after 6 years about, we got completely clear, and since 2002 there's been no more plants recorded on this particular dam. We also have one of the major white invaders is Apuntia stricta. It was reportedly introduced into Kruger in the 1950s as an ornamental in Skakuza, and spread out to our management units now covering nearly 670 square kilometers. So it's spread out over a large area. But what one needs to bear in mind is if you just look at that photo, that's just a small portion of the larger landscape in where these plants occur. There's no roads, there's no trails, and there's no access. And if you think of herbicide control, which is effective, it means walking in there with knapsack sprayers, which was very difficult. So we then introduced the cochineal, the biocontrol agent, near Skakuza in one of the worst infested areas. And within a year, we had a major success. It was very effective. So we then started mass rearing the cochineal and actively releasing it in the field. And we have had quite good success. So now we've continued rearing the insects and spreading them out to assist in the dispersal. However, just as you think you're starting to get some programs in place and getting a handle on some things, we get new surprises. Some of you will know the species. Last month, we found Kutsuvine naturalized in the field. And while we were looking for it, we found a few plants, and then not far away from it, we found some big infestations already starting, and the plants were starting to climb over the trees along there. So this is now a major concern for us, and we've started already. The teams have started clearing, but it's a new challenge for us. So just in closing, obviously my presentation was focused on sandparks, but there's a lot of research showing the threat to national parks and protected areas around Africa, social, ecological, and ecosystem threats. So a lot more work is needed in these areas. And of course, this needs to be scaled up globally, especially if we look at the information from the GLONAF program on the abundance of naturalized species around the world. So with that, thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, Llewellyn. That was very good, very interesting. I just wanted to mention we are recording the event, as I said earlier. My colleague Rudy will post into the chat the location if anybody wants to go back and look at the presentations. So now we have about 35 minutes for questions and comments for our panel. Raise your hand or put something in the chat. Or if you want, we'd like to hear about some of the issues you're dealing with in your protected areas. I saw some things were going on in the chat earlier. Anybody have any questions for the panel? Somebody's got their hand raised.
I do have
Oh, okay.
a question for both the last speakers and also for Terry. Do you see, would you say that you see a stabilization regarding the number of alien taxa, alien plant taxa in protected areas in your countries, or do you witness an increase of the number? I'm talking about the number of alien invasive taxa, not the size of the FOTSI.
So the number of species, Jean-Marc, is that what you're asking? Yes, we do. I cited that one study from Miller et al. And one of the things that they noted in their work, so that was limited to eastern forests, but that when they were able to see control and decreases in some species, new species were coming in. We are seeing new species. Yes.
From our areas, it did seem to stabilize. There did seem to be a plateau at one stage, but we have started seeing a few more species either in the park and a couple of other species on our boundary that we weren't aware of at all until recently. So, and those are highly invasive. So that's it. They are quite a lot of concern. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, anybody else? Any questions or comments? Well, I'm surprised. I thought we'd have a lot of comments and conversation since we have had some.
May I ask another question?
Oh, sure.
Especially regarding South Africa, do you rely today mostly on biological control, or do you still use some other types of control, mainly chemical? What is the situation today in South Africa?
I think that it's very integrated. There is a lot of biocontrol. There's a lot of biocontrol research happening in the country. And so there's new agents in development for species that are widely spread, and also some of the earlier invasions. But chemical mechanical control is still probably predominantly control method in many areas. And I don't foresee that changing. I think that is one of our main tools that we have available. Just for although where possible, we do use biocontrol when we not able to get on top of it in mechanically or chemically.
Okay.
Okay, Terry had her hand up.
Well, I would ask a similar question of Jean-Marc. So in the US, we use the whole suite, but parks tend to be conservative when it comes to biological control. So we are trying to encourage them to make greater use of them, because there is quite a system of review before anything is introduced. And I think that there's a fear based on some historic catastrophic introductions, we shall say, that keeps parks from using that tool. So how about in Israel?
So far, we use biocontrol only against invasive species of arthropods, not plants. There is currently a trial for using a vivil that was developed in South Africa, a vivil that is feeding on the seeds of Akatsiya Saligna. But we do not have a lot of biocontrol, and it doesn't seem that we will have some in the coming future. But the situation in Israel is very different from what you have in South Africa and the US because of the size of the protected areas. In South Africa, and I guess the same applies for the US, in many cases, you absolutely have no choice but using a biocontrol, because the extent of the areas is such that you cannot apply other types of control. And what you said about previous failures or problem that we have had during the 20th century with biocontrol is true, but over the past 20 years, there were a lot of progress regarding the non-target effect of biocontrol. So I think in that aspect of biocontrol has improved very much. There are other issues, but as far as I know, biocontrol is today the only solution for very large protected areas. The problem is that some governments are reluctant in applying biocontrol there are several reasons for that. And also we have to say that according to the literature, we see that there are many biocontrol attempts, but quite a few are successful. In some cases, those which are successful are very successful. In South Africa, there was the case of Azolla filicoloides, that was a floating fern that was controlled with a bioagent, and it was a fantastic success. But I think that we have still a lot to do regarding biocontrol. And in very small countries, biocontrol is, I think, maybe a little less relevant than biocontrol in areas where you deal with very large protected areas. I don't say it is not, but it is less relevant.
Okay, we do have some questions in the chat. One was, do any of the panelists have any experience with Astropatorium innuliifolium? Unfortunately, I don't know what that is, but anybody? Jean-Marc, do you see it in the chat?
Yeah, no, I don't. I even don't know what taxon it is. Sorry.
Okay. I guess we'll have to say we don't have experience with that. And then another question is, how serious are the conflicting interests, and who would be the main agencies that would have to be convinced to collaborate?
Where? In which country? Generally?
I'm not sure. Let's just take your country, for instance.
For sure, the inherent problem with the biological invasions is that when you meet with the decision makers or politicians or people in charge with the Treasury, Ministry of Treasury, is that they cannot understand that they have to take action before disaster. And it's only when the proliferation of invasive species has become obvious that they understand they have to do something. So the main agency we have to convince here in my country, at least, this is the Ministry of Treasury. And this is a very painful problem. As long as we cannot come and prove that what is the extent of the damage of an invasive plant, for example, Ambrosia Confertiflora, it's impossible to convince them to cooperate and to devote some funds for this issue.
Okay, thank you. I have a question for you and for Llewellyn. One of the problems we have in the United States is our garden centers often sell invasive plants, and the unwitting consumer goes and buys them and then puts them in their garden, and that just helps spread the problem. Does Israel or South Africa prohibit such things, or how do you deal with that? Llewellyn?
So, well, the first list would be the species that are on our regulations, the invasive species regulations. So those would not be allowed, and many of them may include ornamentals that you might find there. There's also been work done on outreach or agreements between Nursery Growers Association and clearing programs. I'm not sure where that stands at currently, but the aim was to get some sort of self-regulation going to assist with that. So.
Okay, thanks.
In Israel, the regulations are only beginning. We are not as should I say that, developed or advanced as they are in South Africa, Australia, or New Zealand, for example. And it is very also quite complicated to convince the Ministry of Agriculture to launch a list of banned taxa, and they usually agree to do so only if there is obvious direct negative consequences for agriculture. When it harms natural ecosystems, it is much more complicated. And the second point is that even if you have a list of banned, completely forbidden taxa, the real issue is about the enforcement. If you have not enough inspectors in the country in order to enforce the law with the e-commerce, it doesn't work.
Okay, thank you. So we do have another question. Can you give us some idea of the environmental compliance that has to be completed or maintained in order to implement invasive species control, i.e. spraying, fire, biocontrol in each of your countries? That's a good question.
I'd be happy to start.
Oh, thank you.
So we have, of course, the NEPA, which is the National Environmental Policy Act, that's the environmental protection, and then the historic preservation and historic properties compliance is required as well. So it depends on the impact to the resources and a review. Parks need to, and it happens at the park level primarily, unless it's a very challenging problem, then it may happen at the regional level or the national level. But they determine the level of impact to the resources and then determine what avenue to take. So it could be something simple like a categorical exclusion, which is limited impact and really requires the signature of a superintendent primarily. So these are already in place and they outline the various types of activities that can be conducted. But it could also be an environmental assessment, more time to develop environmental impact statements take the greatest amount of time. So for every activity in parks, some sort of compliance has to be conducted, no matter really even cyclic maintenance activities. But it can be of various levels of rigor, depending on the impact that is determined to occur to the resources.
Thank you. Llewellyn or Jean-Marc, do you want to answer that as well?
Okay, actually in Israel, fire is not an option for the control of invasive plants because the country is too densely populated, and also because fire in many cases would enhance and increase the germination rate of several of the major invasive species. This is particularly true for wattles. And the main point is with the use of chemicals. We have very clear and I think good regulations regarding spraying, but again, we have a problem with the enforcement. For example, too many land managers are using excessive volumes of Roundup, for example, because it is excessively cheap. So they're using too large amounts, and it causes some problems, especially along rivers and streams. There are some good regulations, but the enforcement is a problem.
Okay, thank you. There's another question. Apart from GIST platform, what other websites gather information about control methods for IAS? Not sure I understand it, but
there are lots of online resources available. So through the University of Georgia, there's an invasive species and ecosystem health site, Bugwood and EdMaps. And I can provide, if somebody wants to email me, I can provide a list. There's information on Control NatureServe, which is hosted in Alexandria, Virginia. They provide information. There's CABI, which is more international in nature, which provides information on management techniques. Oh gosh, there are so many there. California has its own invasive plant council website that provides information, but there is so much out there now available online. And again, I'd be happy to provide more information if anybody wants to just reach out to me.
okay, thank you. Yeah, so Terry did put her email address on the chat, so just send her an email. Another question asks, what percentage of each country's park system's budget is dedicated to invasive species work? I'm sure it's pretty small compared to everything else, but
yeah, I mean, it varies a lot, and a lot of funding in our case comes from national government through the Working for Water program. So it's only at some parks where there's a portion of the money spent directly from the park, but a lot of it relies on the national program and what Treasury can support for the public work programs as well.
okay, great. Thank you, Luan.
I can say for the United States, we are not very able to track it because as I mentioned earlier, the management decisions and work often occurs at the park level. And although there are count codes and they can roll those up, it's an underestimate of the amount parks actually devote to invasive plant management. From the national level, we have a number of invasive species coordinators, somebody for freshwater aquatics, marine aquatics, invasive animals, invasive plants, and the IPM. So there are those programs, and the IPMT program is funded at $5 million, which is not a lot of money, and has not changed much over the years since it was first developed in the early 2000s. So not nearly enough to really put much of a dent in the problem, frankly.
Okay, here's another question. What type of education programs do you have to educate the public about the problems of exotic species? I assume in the National Park Service, maybe we have a junior ranger program about it? I don't know.
Yeah, the Park Service is an educational organization, and we do really good outreach. So again, a lot of it happens at the park level, and we do collaborate with others, as I mentioned earlier, who are getting the message out, such as the North American Invasive Species Management Association and the National Wildlife Federation. So we want to use information that's already recognized. We want to jump on the bandwagon basically and repeat what people recognize nationally. So we have our websites. We put out articles on the website. Parks post lots of things on social media. So again, we're a bit decentralized. Information comes from the national office, from the regional office, and the parks are really the ones who are doing the lion's share of the work on education.
How about in Israel or South Africa? Do you have a lot of education programs with school groups or for kids?
Quite a lot of information in Hebrew on the web, and you know, in Israel, it's such a small country, it's quite easy to reach everyone and quite rapidly. So yes, we are doing so. It's quite recent. I mean, if we look back 15 years ago, the situation is completely different. But the problem we have here with the issue of biological invasions, and I think it's the same worldwide, is that most of the attention regarding environmental issues is taken by global warming or global change or global issues. But when you're talking about invasive species, you look at it generally at a regional or local scale. And unfortunately, it's very difficult to be on the same stage when we're dealing with the problem of invasive species.
Sure. Llewellyn, did you want to add anything, or?
I guess ours varies a lot by park as well, but we also try and make use of some of the bigger programs, the Weed Buster, week kind of idea. Some parks have got social ecology departments that are involved in various outreach programs, so it varies across the parks generally. But probably we should be doing more than what we're are busy with.
Okay, great. Any final questions for the panel, or? I think I got everybody.
I have one comment, Dave, if that's okay. I see Kurt Duser put a comment about recognizing the problem before, and Jean-Marc mentioned this too. I mean, the whole prevention, the idea of prevention, it's hard to get support for it when prevention is really where our money should be going. Prevent those big problems from happening, but it's hard to convince lawmakers and, you know, our representatives that because there's no problem that we should be putting our funds there, but that's why we should be putting our funds there.
I should mention that Kurt and I went to South Africa many years ago to look specifically at invasive species within South Africa, and I'm sure we visited Kruger and we visited some other sites. It was a very good trip.
Yeah, I don't know if you all can hear me, but I did want to chime in before this is over to say hello to Llewellyn. On that tour, it was in 1999. I got the privilege to spend a few days touring Kruger with Llewellyn, showing me lots of his invasive plant problems. And then I think we met up again in Florida during an international invasive species conference, I think in about 2003. We went to a hockey game, but it's good to see you, Llewellyn.
Yeah, thanks.
That's great.
Actually, just a follow up, on your Opuntia biocontrol, I think it was the Cactoblastus insect you were using to control that, and you gave some examples. I recall you had a fence exclosure that was set up to exclude baboons. And I remember there was some impact relation going on with the baboons and the biocontrol. Could you maybe refresh my memory on that, and how's that going, Llewellyn?
So that was for the Cactoblastus Cacturum moth that had been introduced earlier on, I think in the late 80s, 90s already, before the cochineal had been established. Cactoblastus had been really effective elsewhere in South Africa and Australia, some places on similar species, and Opuntia stricta, but we weren't getting the same level of Africa. And one of the thoughts was that the baboons were actually eating the larvae from the plant, that especially that they might have learned that during the drought. So yeah, that's why it was set up initially. They did show that there was some impact or some effect of the baboons on the larvae, but possibly not at the level that would have had such a large scale effect on the Cactoblastis. So that's why they brought in the cochineal to Kruger to try and see if that biocontrol could work better.
You. Great to see you again. You too, Dave.
Yeah, likewise. I knew that I'd met Llewellyn, but I just wasn't sure. So this gives me context. So thanks for the reminder. Anyway, any further questions before we let everybody go? It's been a very interesting session. I learned a lot, and I hope everybody else did too. I think I got everybody in the chat that I could see. Again, I hope to have another webinar on invasive animal species that will be upcoming, and then hopefully one on management of fossil resources. So if you have an interest, let me know. Okay, I guess that concludes our meeting today. Thanks for our panelists for staying late or getting up early. Appreciate that. And everybody else that got on today as well. So we'll see you next time. Thanks again.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dave.
Bye.
Bye.